This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Okay, so it's still morning. Welcome everyone to week 3. So just as a refresher for what's happening this week, a reminder that quiz 1 is to be completed this week, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Today we'll be looking at investigating system requirements. We'll be looking at it this topic will be over 2 weeks, and basically we'll be looking at a few techniques, some analysis activities that need to be carried out as a systems analyst, and looking at stakeholders. Important to recognise stakeholders when we're looking at requirements, and we'll also have a look at the scenario in the book, an introduction to the scenario of the RMO Consolidated Sales and Marketing System project. So for today's lecture, hopefully you've all looked at and or read or done the pre-preparation, read chapter 2, read the slides and watch that video on functional and non-functional requirements. To reinforce, I've got a summary for the week, and I've also got a chapter, a crossword. I'm just going to go into this crossword because there are not individual links for the crosswords, and I want to show you, as well as the benefit of the externals and for those that aren't here today, how to actually access these particular crosswords, which vary from chapter to chapter. So if you click on the link which has the crossword on there, you'll see this page comes up. Just for reference, if you want the online chapters, and if you haven't accessed them, it's the same link that I gave to the online chapters, and it's down the bottom right here. So what you need to do is you select the chapter that we are doing for a given week. For example, chapter 4, and that changes to a 4, and you get some resources here, and you click on crossword puzzle, and the crossword actually comes up. Okay, so it's an interactive crossword where you look at the questions, you type in the answers, and it tells you if it's incorrect or correct. Or if you want to just skip straight to the solution and not have any learning as your outcome, well, that's up to you. But I will be providing crosswords. Well, it's going to be the same link each week. I just wanted to show you how you actually get to the crossword for a given week. Okay? That's how you access the crosswords. Now, as part of your assessment, this week you do have to do quiz 1, which is based on topic 1 and chapter A. By topic 1, I just mean the first lecture. Given that our first lecture there was no chapter to read, it was just pretty much the course outline. So topic 1 and online chapter A are the readings that you need to do before attempting the first quiz. So I'll just go into the quiz, very similar in terms of format to the orientation quiz, the sample quiz that you had to do, which is why I asked you to do that quiz, so you could be familiar with how to use the quizzes and how I've set them up. So if you just click on the quiz, it'll open up, and I've got some instructions of what you need to do. You need to read the topic. You've got 30 minutes to complete the quiz. Quizzes are available for the entire week. So Monday of week 3 closes at 11 p.m, Sunday of week 3. You get 2 attempts at the quiz, and the highest mark will be recorded. So if you get 16 for your first attempt and you think that's pretty good, you can still go again, and if you get 14 for the second attempt, the 16 will be the one that's recorded. So don't fear of doing it twice for fear of you're going to get a lower score.
Are they the same questions as the second time round?
No. No,
a little bit different.
They are. The questions are random and the responses are in random order. So you've obviously tried and done the quiz. So that's one of my strategies. So yeah, you're not all going to get the same quiz on the same day, and you're not going to get the same quiz after the second iteration as well. So I think it's good practice, and it exposes you to the different types of questions that you could get on that topic.
And it takes the highest score.
And it's good that so I'm assuming you got worse in your second than you. So yeah, the highest score is counted. But I think it just adds value and gives you the extra learning by trying the quiz twice. So yeah, that's pretty much about the quiz. And you've got till 11 p.m. Sunday to complete it. So the links to the quiz, well, the link to the quiz is here, but you can also access the quiz links from the assessments tab. Okay, so if you go to the assessment tab and you scroll down, you'll notice that I've got the sample quiz there and also essay quiz 1. Yes?
So with the assignment 1 gonna, like the instruction and stuff gonna...
That's my next sentence. Assignment 1 will be up very shortly as well. That's due at the end of week... See, I've got it in here. Assignment. 10th of April. I believe that's the end of week 6. So I'll be posting that shortly. I'll put a note on the discussion forum once that is available. That assignment and the specifications will appear here. A2 assignment individual. The specs will be here in the assessments tab. Okay, so you'll get some instructions. I'll also provide a marking rubric so you can be familiar with how you're going to be graded and what I'm looking for, so you can set yourself a benchmark of what you need to achieve to get the maximum possible marks or the minimum possible marks, whatever strategy you've got put in place to succeed in your studies. But that's where the specs will be. And once I've put it up, there'll also be some instructions here for week 3 or week 4 that says, as part of your assessment, work on assignment 1. And I have a link to the assessments tab down here. So it will all be in your weekly readings and it will become available. Once I've posted it, it will appear. I'll post a message on the forum and I'll probably discuss it in a bit more detail in next week's lecture in terms of the requirements and if anyone's got any questions about the assignment, etc., etc. Are there any other questions at this point in time before I begin the lecture for today? No? Okay. Fantastic. So again, I'm working on the assumption that you've all read these slides, or at least had a look at the slides, but more importantly that you've watched the videos as well, because the videos are adding value to the lectures that I've put on the website, and I'm expecting that you've watched those before coming to class to give you a bit of an extra understanding of the things that I'm going to be talking about. Can I just have a show of hands, just out of curiosity for today, who has watched the video for today? All right, some of you have. Excellent. For the others, just try and keep up with what I've got on there, because I'm not necessarily going to always explain the concepts. Probably from next week onwards, I'm hoping to, rather than go through the slides, because I want you to have the pre-reading, we're going to start actually doing things in class. It probably doesn't kick in until next week or a little bit further, where we start having to think about stakeholders, where we start having to think about interviews, where we start creating use case diagrams, all these diagrams. Rather than me read over the lecture slides, I'd like to have a scenario that we work through each week, and I'll show you and we can discuss as a team and as a class how to work through and create some of these artifacts that need to be done as a systems analyst. Why? Because I think you learn better by seeing examples and learn by doing, so we can do it together and I can demonstrate to you how things are done. Not only that, you'll get to practice these concepts in the following week in your tutorial, and even more so, you will need to do them for your assignment come your exam. Okay, so the more strategies we can put in place to get the thinking out loud in terms of how we come about resolving solutions to these problems and working through the solutions, then when you get asked a question in your assignment and you have to create a diagram and or your exam, you'll think, oh, I do remember having done that in class a couple of times. Make sense? Okay. So pre-preparation is all I ask before coming to class. I'll most likely put up a case study or refer you to a case study either or before the lecture if I'm going to talk about it. So I'd want you to have read that case study. It's not going to be 15 pages, maybe half a page or a page. So you're familiar with that case study so we can then work through that scenario in class. All right? So investigating system requirements. These are the things you should be able to do after completing this topic. Okay, we're going to look at the systems analysis activities. Okay, what do we mean by systems analysis? What activities are involved in performing systems analysis? And looking at those, I guess, in detail to establish what needs to get done as a systems analyst. One of the things we need to do is to gather requirements for a system. In order to do that, you need to kind of have a benchmark within yourself of a series of questions that you're going to ask of people when gathering those requirements, correct? You need to know what questions to ask. Why do you want to ask those questions? Because you need to know what the system does and or what the new system has to do. Okay, so we need to distinguish first or explain or know the difference between functional and non-functional requirements. And that's what the video was based on, looking at functional and non-functional requirements. We'll look at those in a moment. You need to be able to identify and understand different skills or different kinds of stakeholders and their contributions to requirements definition. Okay? In an organisation, there are lots of people that we need to liaise with and interact with. It's really important not only to liaise and interact, but to actually understand and know who your stakeholders are, so you can talk to the right people. If you're not talking to the right people, you're not getting the right message and the right scenario built up to understand what the requirements are and what's happening. And then we'll have a look at, in this week, I'm just going to list some information gathering techniques, and then next week we'll look at those techniques in a bit more detail. So again, Chapter 2 is the reading for this week and next week. So Chapter 1, which you all should have read last week before coming to last week's tutorial, introduced the System Development Lifecycle, otherwise known as the SDLC. And it gave, I guess, a scenario or an example of the small project that is looked at in the textbook. I guess this chapter expands, I'll get it right in a minute, expands on the process involved in developing a system and where systems analysis fits within that whole regime. Okay, and the component we're looking at is the systems analysis component. So a bit of an overview of what's going to be covered this week, which is called Process 3 in that systems development life cycle. Again, assuming that you've looked at and read some of these slides, if you haven't, I strongly suggest you go back rather than me just regurgitating what's written on there. So RMO is the organisation and the case that's provided in the scenario, Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters. They've got some existing systems, they've got some new systems that they want to incorporate, and you should have probably looked and watched part of the video which introduced RMO in last week's tutorial. But the major project that basically came out as a need for RMO was a project to have a new consolidated sales and marketing system. Okay, so that's what is the scenario, a new CSMS as they call it. So I guess in order to come up with that, they needed to have an understanding and look at the technology architecture, the application architecture, and there's just a couple of definitions here of what we mean by technology architecture and application architecture. Important within an organisation to understand those particular architectures, whether it's the organisation that provides that understanding and or the systems analyst that has to have that understanding. Without that understanding, we can't propose solutions to problems, or we can't recognise what problems are. Okay, so looking at the existing application architecture, they have supply chain management, the phone mail order system, the retail store system, and the customer support system. Okay, and it gives you a breakdown of the existing application architecture, what those systems have, what they integrate with, and or what they don't integrate with. So again, as part of the last week's video, you should have come across this, which shows you how all the systems work and fit together. We have supply chain management, we have the CSMS, which is going to integrate with the supply chain management system, and this is basically the system that's something new that is being introduced by RMO, which has a sales subsystem and an order fulfillment subsystem. Okay, remember I mentioned, or have mentioned, or I'll keep mentioning, one organisation doesn't have one information system. Okay, and one information system in itself is not necessarily one information system. It can have components, it could have subsystems. And we can see that in this particular scenario where the CSMS has a sales subsystem and an order fulfillment subsystem. So you can treat those as kind of two projects being developed, integrated, worked on, created, whatever, to form part of the entire CSMS. Okay, so we've got to think about what we're producing, what we're providing, and whether we can break that down into manageable chunks in order to produce a holistic solution. Also has customer account subsystem and a marketing subsystem. So quite a number of subsystems within that entire system. And they don't, in this book, look at every single system, but certain components. So in terms of systems analysis, what are the activities? We need to look at the systems development life cycle and I guess work through the whole cycle of developing a system, which does involve quite a number of steps. And we need to think about what those steps are, and we need to be aware of where our role as a systems analyst fits in within that systems development life cycle. Now initially, I guess you think about project planning and project management. Who from this audience has done my project management course? Who from here is doing IT project management next study period? The majority of you, some of you. If you're not doing it next study period, you're probably doing it in SP5 next year, or if you haven't enrolled yet, you'll probably find that you might be. If you haven't, you might have trouble getting into the class because it's pretty full. Anyway, project planning and project management are covered in detail in this textbook, but we're not covering it within this course. It's a prelude to systems analysis. As part of your degree, you'll be doing a project in your final year. We want to introduce you to project management and concepts so you can be aware of how to manage projects, how to think about projects, not just from a systems analyst perspective, but from an IT perspective and a generic perspective. So the project management component is not in this course. You'll be doing a separate course, completely different, separate to this one, called IT project management. So what we'll be looking at for systems analysis is core process number 3, which is core process number 3. We've got core processes, discover and understand details. This is where the analysis activities kick in, where we gather detailed information, where we define the requirements and prioritise the requirements, develop user interface dialogues, and evaluate the requirements with the users. What's the importance of the last step, and why do you think evaluate requirements with the users is there at the end? Why is it even there at all?
You're doing it to satisfy the user's needs.
I can't see who said that. Can you just put your hand up?
Because you're doing it to satisfy the user's needs.
You're doing it to satisfy the user's needs, but why should you evaluate the requirements with them?
So you can see whether you've met their needs.
You can see that they've met their needs, that you've understood their needs, that they've actually articulated their needs as they're supposed to be articulated, because sometimes the users don't even know what they want and what they need until they see it. And some people are visual people, so until you articulate something and write it down or demonstrate or show it to them based on your understanding of what they've told you, then they can actually articulate and say, that's exactly what I want, or no, that's not what I meant, I actually meant this, this, this and this. You can refine your requirements before moving on to the next phase, which is designing the system components. It'd be horrible to design components that don't meet the user's requirements, or misunderstood requirements, or incorrect requirements. So really important. So gathering detailed information, and we'll be looking at some of these next week. There's heaps of things that you can do. There's different ways of gathering techniques. There's different processes, interviews, questionnaires. What do I mean by documents?
Help documents.
Yeah, help documents. What else do I mean by documents in terms of gathering detailed information?
Reports. Yeah.
Reports? What reports would you be? Would you be creating reports?
You might be looking at a report to see what you can add to it.
Looking at a report to see what you can get to it. What else? What else do I mean by documents? What do you think I mean by documents in terms of gathering detailed information about a system or an organisation?
Gathering the physical things that people are actually using at the moment.
Yeah, looking at the current organisational processes. If you can't, sometimes you can't speak to everybody, and sometimes you can't speak to the right person to see what's going on in an organisation, to understand their business processes, to understand a scenario or a situation. So in some cases, you need to actually obtain business documents to form part of your research and gather detailed information. Observing business processes where we actually watch people doing things. Researching vendors, okay? Seeing what's out there, what people provide as potential solutions to a problem. And getting comments and receiving suggestions, okay? So these are other things that we need to also do. Define the requirements. We need to model the functional requirements and the non-functional requirements. And there is a difference between the two. Clear difference between the functional and the non-functional requirements. And you need to understand and recognise those differences as part of your group assignment. Prioritise requirements. Why do we need to prioritise requirements? Why do you think we need to prioritise?
To know what you should do at the beginning, or like what are the most important things that you have to do?
Yeah, to know what's important to do at the beginning, what's important to do, because from a customer's perspective, don't we want everything? Really? We want everything? But everything sometimes is not feasible or manageable or within the cost or within the budget or within the time frame. So you need to prioritise requirements in terms of what is essential, important, versus what's nice to have. Develop user interface dialogue. So how is the interaction going to occur between the user and the system? What are the screens going to look like? What buttons need to... How are we going to interact from a user's perspective? How does the user interact with the system? Okay, you need to understand the user interface dialogues. And you need to evaluate the requirements with the user. And that can involve user involvement, feedback, and you've got to be willing to adapt to changes that may be provided to you as a result of that evaluation having occurred. So we've got system requirements equals functional and non-functional. Functional are the activities the system must perform. The system must print a report. The system must record transactions. The system must enter an inventory item. Thank you. The system must do this. What must the system perform? It must do this, 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 and this. These are the functions of the system. The non-functional requirements, however, are other system characteristics, such as the system must be available 24 hours a day. The system must have these performance measures. The system must be able to perform backups, etc., etc. So they're not part of the actual functions, but they still need to be part of the system. Other system characteristics. And if you watch that video, it gives you some examples of functional versus non-functional requirements. When we talk about functional and non-functional requirements, there's an acronym that's referred to, the FERPS Plus requirements acronym. And that gives you a bit more of a, I guess, insight into what we mean by the functional versus the non-functional requirements. So usability, reliability, performance, security, and there's the plus is even more categories, which is these ones here. So that's, I guess, an overview or a holistic view of what we mean by functional versus non-functional requirements. So business rules and processes, and this is all the non-functional. Both just as important as each other, and you need to establish what those requirements are in order to be able to come up with a suitable system for an organisation that's going to solve their business problem. Okay? So these are some of those other things that are mentioned in that particular slide. Why do we need to involve stakeholders? Why do we care about stakeholders?
Because they're the clients, not clients.
They're the client, or they might represent the client, or they may interact with the system. Do we only have one stakeholder? No, we have multiple stakeholders. And there are different categories of stakeholders. Okay, so a stakeholder is not necessarily someone that works for the organisation that you are creating or providing this advice to or this system to. A stakeholder is a person who has an interest in the successful implementation of the new system. Okay? And an interest can have different and varying forms depending on your interpretation of the word and the meaning of interest. We have internal stakeholders who are obviously people within the organisation. External stakeholders, people outside of the organisation. Oh, I need to change those to S's. Operational stakeholders, people who regularly interact with the system and operate the system. Executive stakeholders, they don't necessarily have a daily interaction, or they don't directly interact with the system, but they use the information or have financial interest. Okay, so your senior managers or your executive stakeholders aren't the ones that are necessarily using that transaction processing system or that web entry system, but they have an interest in the system because they want to know how successful it is, and they might be receiving some sort of business intelligence or reports or analytics from that system to determine whether the system is actually meeting the organisation's goals and creating some sort of competitive advantage as an organisation in terms of what they're doing, whether it's introducing efficiencies or providing efficiencies into the organisation, etc., etc. So not directly involved in using it, but they have an interest in it and they're a recipient of the information. So important to recognise that we do have stakeholders, they do have an interest in the successful implementation of the system, and that there are varying categories of stakeholders. Okay. So, give you some examples. This is the stakeholders of a comprehensive accounting system for a public company. We've got obviously this grid here in terms of internal operational, external operational, external executive and internal executive. So they all have an interest in the particular system, i.e. the accounting system, and they are matched, or they fit within this particular grid. Okay, now as part of your group assignment and the case study that probably we'll be looking at in class, hopefully, you will need to identify the stakeholders for that system. That's one of your roles as a systems analyst. What is the system? What are the functional requirements? What are the non-functional requirements? And who are the stakeholders? Okay, so this is something that you need to consider and look at and be aware of. And we'll also be looking at it in next week's tutorial and or the week after, in terms of practicing, thinking about a scenario, looking at the requirement types and identifying varying forms of stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders for the RMO CSMS project? And you wouldn't think that there are many stakeholders in an organisation or using a system, but once you actually really start thinking about it and breaking it down, there can be quite a significant amount of stakeholders. And as you can see here, we've got quite a lot of stakeholders for the RMO CSMS project. Okay? Whether it's marketing, sales, accounting managers, senior execs, customers, shippers, warehouse and shipping personnel, and the phone and mail sales order clerks or clerks, however you want to pronounce it. So quite a number of stakeholders for that system. These are the internal stakeholders, and here we've got an organisational chart. Why do you think it's important to source and or be aware of the organisational chart and or structure?
So you know who's in charge of whatever.
So you know who's in charge of whatever you need to know about, maybe? Yeah. Gives you a hierarchical view, gives you a visual view. Why do we want that view?
You might not be making the system for everyone, you might just be making it for a particular...
You might be making the system for a particular area or a particular group. So, do you need to speak to someone at the senior level? Yes, I do. Okay, let's talk to this person. Are you creating a system that is related to marketing and sales? Yes, let's speak to William McDougall because he's in charge of marketing and sales. Do we need to speak to someone that's in charge of looking at catalogue sales? Yes, well, we need to involve Robert. So it gives you a view of who works in the organisation, what their role perhaps is in the organisation, and how they fit into the hierarchy, so you as a systems analyst can, I guess, make a determination of who's going to form part of your stakeholder group. And it might be, in this case, that you need to talk to all of them at some point in time. But inviting everybody to the same meeting when it's not relevant to them is not going to be really successful. And you're not going to get buy-in from them next time you schedule a meeting because they're going to think it's not valuable to them and you're wasting their time. So you've also got to be strategic in terms of identifying your stakeholder groups and whether you have varying groups and who you need to speak to at certain points in time. So really important. So, not much more I want to talk about today. In terms of information gathering techniques, we'll look at in detail next week. But I think it's important to recognise and understand interviewing users and other stakeholders. Okay, What are some ways, or have any of you been involved in interviews before? Yes? What are different scenarios that you can be involved in with interviews? Group interviews? Questionnaires?
Could be a task that you're trying to do.
Could be a task that you get done, have to do in an interview. Could be an individual interview. A webinar. Yep. Has anyone ever had a phone interview? Yeah, phone interview. So we need to think about, as a systems analyst, interviewing is a great technique. When do we normally use interviewing as a technique?
When you need to know the people's perspective or what they think, so you can improve or...
Yeah, when you need to know the people's perspective and what they think. And generally it's for well, I can't really say that because they've changed it now. You can't really say interviewing is for more of a one-on-one thing because now they do group interview sessions. So that's changed of late. But it's important to interview and know which stakeholders you need to interview. And having a series of skills in terms of how do you interview. Because is the person that you're interviewing going to have a nice long 3-hour chat with you? Not likely, is it? Okay, so you've got to have some tips and strategies put into place in terms of how you conduct that interview as a systems analyst and who you are interviewing. And there's a whole series of steps that need to be thought about and carried out even before you conduct the interview. And that's something we'll be talking about next week. Distributing and collecting questionnaires. When do you think is the ideal scenario of when we distribute and collect questionnaires?
When you want to interview so many people, like a really big amount of people.
Yeah, when you've got a larger audience. Okay? Distributing questionnaires is really good. What are some formats of distributing and questionnaires and collecting information? Survey? How can we distribute a survey? Email? Online?
Maybe supermarkets?
Yeah, supermarkets can do surveys or questionnaires. Spam. Yes, spam. We get lots of those. Fill out this questionnaire and you can win $1 trillion and we'll put it in your bank account if you give us your bank account details. No, thank you. Different ways we can distribute and collect questionnaires. And there's Survey Monkeys. Anyone use Survey Monkey? That's an online questionnaire thing that can be used as well. Yeah, by phone. Yeah, different ways. So think about the difference between the two. Understand when it's useful to use one versus the other, and then implement the techniques and the strategies to gather the information from your respective audience. But not only gather the information, it's all well and good to have it, what are you going to do with it? Okay, so you need to have some strategies in place to be able to analyse that information. Reviewing inputs, outputs and documentation, and that's one of the things that we talked about. You sometimes can't get the information you need by interviewing people and by distributing and collecting questionnaires. So you may need to actually refer to organisational documents to get a perspective or a grounding or a foundation or an introduction to that organisation or perhaps the systems and processes that they have. Observing and documenting business procedures. Again, another mechanism. We can watch people in the workplace. What do you think we might find sometimes, though, if we're watching people carry out their job in the workplace? It changes what they do. Why would it change what they do? Because you're more self-conscious of what you do? Why else?
You might do have a shortcut, but it's not in the policy. So.
You might have a shortcut of doing something, but it's not in the policy. But hey, let's work smarter, not harder. But let's not tell everyone that we're working smarter, not harder, so we can have a bit more free time to surf the net or answer some emails or do some shopping or whatever. I'm not saying that's done, but in reality, we all try to work smarter, not harder. And if there's an organisational process that can be streamlined, that's fantastic for the individual. But sometimes that individual might not want to share that streamlining process and procedure. Why? Why wouldn't you want to share that streamlining process or procedure?
Then the supervisor will say they should be doing more.
That's right. You might get more jobs. You might get more work to be done. Or everyone might get that new streamlined and procedure, and then everyone's going to get more work.
and there might not be the work for everyone to have, so someone might...
There might not be the work for everyone to have, so someone could lose their job. Fantastic. Excellent. Okay, so...
More work, so that way they get promoted because they're doing more work than everyone else.
Yeah, but why should you be the person that's doing more work when everyone else is doing less work? Just because you've...
More money.
It's not... Christian, I'll tell you that now. Doing more work doesn't necessarily mean you get more money. If there's 3 people doing the same role, if you're finding streamlined processes, they'll give you more work to do, but your job title is still going to be the same job title, so you might not necessarily get more money. Okay, so that's why people can feel threatened as well by having people observe their procedures. But sometimes you can't get an understanding of how something's done until you watch someone do it. Researching vendor solutions. Why do you think researching vendor solutions is important? See what's out there as a systems analyst. Are you going to recommend a solution to someone without having researched what's out there? What if you don't know what's out there yourself?
Find out.
How you find out? How do you find out?
Researching vendor solutions.
Okay, or asking people. If you don't know the answer to a particular problem or a scenario, one of the key strategies that we as individuals should have is knowing who to ask to help us find that solution to that problem. And as I mentioned in the tute this morning with my class, we don't know the answer to everything, okay? But the key to being strategic and smart and working smarter, not harder, is knowing who to ask to help you resolve that problem or that thing that you don't know about. Because someone is likely to know and be able to help you. People are willing to help if you ask the right people and ask the right questions in the right manner. And collecting active user comments and suggestions. So really reflecting on and looking at what information you've been provided and whether there have been any comments made or suggestions made. It's really important to gather your information, but not just to gather it and go away and use that information. Yes, you can do that, but you need to reflect on the information you've been given and provided and ensure that it's correct and that you've understood the requirements properly and that you've been given the requirements in an appropriate manner and that they've been detailed correctly. So this week we've looked at, I guess, looking at CSMS. If you haven't looked at the video for functional versus non-functional requirements, please do so, because it'll give you a grounding and a basic understanding of what the difference is between the two, because you will need to have a look at those for your assignment. We'll be practicing it in the tutorial. And next week we'll look at these in more detail so you get an understanding of what needs to be done. Pre-read. If I give you a case study, please read it before coming to class. Your first assignment will have some sort of question about looking at tools and technologies and perhaps researching some vendor solutions or looking at tools, as well as something to do with an information gathering technique. Okay, so that's it for today. Does anyone, if you haven't filled out the list, please tick your name off the roll, which is over there for this week. Does anyone have any questions at this point in time? Okay, we'll see you all next week. I'll post a message on the discussion board when the assignment has been posted.